Right. Okay. This is a new study here. We finished up Titus, and so all that is available on YouTube. So if you care to go and watch any of it again, I do look at the statistics every so often and see not who's viewing it so much, but more, how many views there are. And it's just interesting to, see that there's, actually quite a few people that log in and look at the thing, which I'm thankful for. So, and as the YouTubers would say, give us a like and, subscribe to our channel and, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, if you want to go and do that, that's great. It helps in all those efforts with all the money that I make on YouTube. Just fine. Anyway, um, right. So the new series that I felt sort of led to go to, as I was praying for, about what to talk about, was to go back into Matthew. I know that we, studied the Sermon on the Mount and chapters 8 and 9, which was all those stories of Jesus substantiating his authority as the king of the kingdom. And as Matthew talks, much about the kingdom in the gospel. But there's a phrase that really drew my attention, and so I went and studied it and looked at it. And it's looking at these parables of the kingdom in the Gospel of Matthew, and the phrase there, as you see right above the crown, is the kingdom of heaven is like. So there's 11 different parables that use this phrase. One of them doesn't. There's a 12th one that doesn't, but it's critical in terms of getting the stage sort of set up for these particular parables. And most of them are found in Matthew 13. But so what today is going to be is not so much looking at particular parables, but it is going to be doing more of an overview of what is happening in this particular situation. So just click here. So the question here is really what is a parable? Because Jesus used parables quite a lot in his teaching, and it is a method of showing something, but it is quite particular, and sometimes we would get parables confused with other kinds of storytelling exercises. So, but we'll just go through what it is, and I'll just click on properly here. But it is from the Greek word parabole, which means placing one thing beside another. So, so as you see there in the word itself, parable, it has the PRA or the PARA prefix on it, which means getting alongside. So if you think about how that's used in English words, when you talk about a para-church organization, STARS would be a para-church organization, CEF would be a para-church organization, Christians Against Poverty would be a para-church organization, and these are charities that work alongside of the church, helping the local church to do what they need to do. So people within STARS would be helping the church help people that have addiction problems. CAP, the Christians Against Poverty, would be people that get alongside the church to help people with financial difficulties. CEF, Child Evangelism Fellowship, would be a parachurch organization helping with children's ministry and so on and so forth. So, if the church itself was well and able to do all these things, then they wouldn't need the aid of something getting alongside of it. But anyway, and we may have heard the term paralegal. If somebody is working within a law society and they are labeled as a paralegal, that means they're not a lawyer, they're not a solicitor, but they work alongside of those people doing a lot of legal work. So basically the idea of para is getting alongside. So a parable is then, basically taking a story of a common kind of understanding and placing it against then a greater truth. So, and really, I think to put the idea of a parable in a nutshell is that it is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And and, and Jesus, 35, and I found this quite interesting, 35% of all gospel teaching is in the form of parables. So, and so some of the parables that we read in the gospels are fairly straightforward. And really that's because Jesus then gives us some insight that he gives to the disciples about what certain parables mean, and then we can use that particular structure to apply to other parables. And then there's other parables that are kind of difficult to get. There's like, what is Jesus really talking about here? Because he did speak to the crowds primarily through the use of parables. But then when he got alongside of the disciples, it was more interactive, didactic teaching. So, and then there was some things that Jesus said that were different from parables, different from standard issue teaching. So there was, a variety of ways that Jesus used in terms of getting various kinds of information across. And then there were times where he was, as the Gospel of John would be teaching, that Jesus spoke plainly. He no longer spoke figuratively or with a figure of speech, but he spoke plainly, and especially on the run up to the crucifixion and the resurrection, Jesus spoke very straightforward, about those things, so people were left in no doubt as to what it meant. Sometimes to describe a parable, you need to sort of say what a parable isn't. Okay, so it is not a fable. Okay, I think probably some of the more well-known fables that we would understand would be like Aesop's fables, which would be the tortoise and the hare, the ant and the grasshopper. These kinds of stories that describe a moral or kind of earth-based truth, and they're good. When you think about the tortoise and the hare, the tortoise won the race because he just kind of plodded along and went very methodically, whereas the hare sprinted around and did all these kinds of things, and because of an explosion of energy, kind of went off like a rocket, but didn't go very far, and so the idea was, just do things methodically and you'll get there, go do things slowly, but that it doesn't convey any sort of heavenly truth or spiritual truth. It's a moral thing or a practical thing, and fables obviously, and speaking about the tortoise and the hare being in a race, the tortoise and the hare would never be in a race, that's but it's just using physical elements of nature just to describe a certain kind of idea or moral truth. It is not a myth. Okay, a myth would be a false story bringing definition to a seen truth, and what I mean by that is if you take common myths in terms of that particular day, which would have been the myths that surrounded the Greek pantheon of gods, such as Zeus and Apollo and Artemis and Diana, and all these different gods. Well, all those gods were primarily invented really to bring a reason why certain things exist, why, like within the Greek pantheon of gods, there are the fates. And the fates, we would talk about, fate has it that I was to go and do thus and such. Well, within the fates, there were, I think, three sisters, and the three sisters then dictated, how things would pan out in terms of somebody's life and that kind of thing. So that's why we said, that oh, fate caused that to happen, or something. It carries off into our own language and culture, but that's all based on a false story. But yet, people back then sacrificed to these false gods because those gods then demanded some kind of attention and feeding, basically, so that that all can be shored up and maintained. So Zeus was the king of the gods, but then there was basically other sorts of but in these terms, lesser gods, lesser deities that were then servicing different things. We thought last week there about Artemis, who was the gift of Artemis, which was that huntress who was the sister of Apollo and all this carry on. So and then you had what Atlanta or Atlas, who was a big strong god, all this. So, but primarily in our day and age, we don't really subscribe and buy into myths as in terms of Greek or Roman sorts of systems like that. But we do have our share of myths, where we believe in certain things, and even within Irish culture, there's superstitions, based around leprechauns and the banshee, and all this and the teasy weezy or whatever they're all called, and all these different things that bring some kind of meaning to a what I would say is a seen truth. So, but a parable isn't that. Okay. We also have a proverb. Now, a proverb is a short statement defining a truth. Now, if you want to go and find a pile of proverbs, we'll go to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, written primarily by Solomon, and they're very short little statements that convey a truth about behavior, about thinking, about spiritual aspirations, what happens if you're doing things wrong and where that leads you, and wickedness and so on. So but they're usually short little things, short statements, and they are pretty well defined in terms of what they mean. It is not an allegory either. And if you take John 15, for example, where Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he removes or lifts away. And every branch in me that bears fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit, and so on it goes. It's an allegory in the sense that Jesus is saying, I am the true vine. Well, Jesus isn't a vine, okay? And the Father is not a vine dresser or a farmer, but he is, comparing himself with a code, as it were, to say, this is what I am in sort of a certain kind of meaning. A very popular book that's an allegory is Pilgrim's Progress. You look at the names of the people that are in that book. So you have, Pilgrim, who is named that, prior to conversion, but when he is converted, his name then becomes Christian. That's pretty evident as to, what they mean, in terms of the story. You have Pliable in that story, who's a man who can be sort of, guided in sort of a gullible kind of way, this way and that way, by Apollyon, who's the image of the devil. And then you also have different other men who are, called evangelists and help, and these different things. So if you want to read a good allegory, read Pilgrim's Progress. So So allegories do exist in the Bible, as they do in John 15 and other places. So it's more a difference in form or presentation than the actual essence of the thing. So it's easy to confuse then a parable to an allegory. You think, oh, that thing means this and that and the other. But when Jesus taught a parable, he didn't say this is that, this is this, and that's that. It wasn't until he actually got with the disciples and it says, right, okay, the sower of the seed is the Son of Man, or the enemy is the devil, or whatever. It wasn't until he actually sat down with the disciples and explained these things that it started to venture into kind of allegorical sort of terms. But when he was talking to the crowds, by and large, it was in this form of a parable that would just an earthly story putting across a heavenly meaning. Okay, so that's what it ain't. And really, the strange thing about parables too, is, as Jesus talks about in Matthew 13, is that they were deliberate in terms of hiding truth from those who rejected Jesus as the Messiah. So you had the crowds that were listening to Christ with these particular things, but by and large, the crowd then stopped with that. They saw things, but they didn't perceive. They heard things, but didn't understand. And so it was really the truth was there, but if the crowd didn't ask what it meant, then they didn't get it. Okay, so and that sort of leads to the next point on this particular slide. Is that their truth was revealed to those whom God had opened the spiritual eyes and who asked for their meaning. So if you go to Matthew 13, so you see one a few times, and actually look at a few verses, but in verse 10 of Matthew 13, it says, the disciples came and said to them, why do you speak to them in parables? And so Jesus' answer to this is because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. So, the revelation of truth, comes from God. It cannot be derived from your own wisdom and your own conjecture or your own trying to figure it out. God has to reveal spiritual things to you because in your own self, you're not spiritually alive. So God has to make you alive. He has to, do something by giving you spiritual life so that you can handle this and understand what's happening. But at least the disciples asked the question, and that was because God had whooped up something in them to ask. The crowds didn't ask. If you read through these different parables, the only people that ask are the people that accept Jesus as the Messiah, in order to glean spiritual truth. So they ask this question: why do you speak to them in parables? And so Jesus then gives that answer and quotes from Isaiah 6 about in there in verse 14 where it says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, seeing you will see and not perceive, for the hearts of this people have grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. So people had gotten to a place where they were very, very blasé and very, very dull, just going through, as it were, through a lot of religious motions and that kind of thing. But but God has to bring light. God has to move in the hearts of people to open up that spiritual door. And then when that light is brought, then there's questions asked. Now, if you go on to then verse 36 of that same chapter, where he starts just before he goes into the explanation of the parable of the wheat and the tares, it says in verse 36, and then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. So, so that's where the disciples ask the question, ask and say, Lord, we want to know what these things mean, so Jesus then gives them the answer. Jesus doesn't go, well, you have to go and figure it out for yourself. God is not interested in doing that. God is not that kind. God wants us to know truth. He wants us to hear things by which we will grow and walk with him in a better way. So that's basically what a parable is, kind of in a nutshell there. Now, then this brings me to the question of what is the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so I was reading through Bill McDonald's book here, Believer's Commentary, about this, and I found this very good, very straightforward. And so, Matthew is the one that uses this statement about the kingdom of heaven. So now, the kingdom of heaven, in general terms, is the sphere, it's the space, it's the realm in which God's rule is acknowledged. Okay, so it is not the kingdom of the earth. It is not the kingdom of the devil or anything. This is the kingdom of heaven. This is, because heaven is the place where God is, where God rules. That it's up, it's high, it's above things. You can't get higher than heaven in terms of a space. And that's where God is. That's where he rules, and that's where his rule is acknowledged. So, but within the discussion of the kingdom of heaven, Jesus then explores a whole bunch of different avenues, and he talks about two different aspects. And the first aspect is an outward profession, and we talk sometimes about people who make professions of faith. They come out and they use the language of a Christian. They in some ways act like one, but they're just putting on the airs and graces in order to be seen as something, and I've always heard people talk about, good living people and people that are good living for a living, and all this kind of stuff that we hear in Northern Ireland. So, but the one who has an outward profession is it would include all who claim to recognize God's rule, and the kind of operative word there is the who claim. So this is a big catchment of people who make a profession of faith and say, yes, I subscribe to God's rule, God's authority. But as we'll see, like in the parable of the tares, and some of the parables of Dragnet and all these sorts of things, we'll see that there are going to be people in this kingdom that aren't, they're professors, but they're not possessors, if I can put it in those terms. And the second aspect is that there is an inward reality, and this is what MacDonald suggests here. He says, including only those who enter the kingdom by conversion. So there's people that profess, but then there are the real kingdom citizens that are there by conversion. They're the real members. They're the real subjects of this particular kingdom. So now the Bible does talk an awful lot about kingdom, about God's kingdom. and it has 5 phases. And a phase, usually phases are sequential, meaning they're one after another. If you ever watch rugby, if you look up in the upper corner of the screen, there'll be the score, the time, and then as the team is making their way down to the other down to the touch line of the opponent, as they're moving the ball, you will see phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and sometimes then trying to get down to the try, you see all these multiple phases, and it's just that each step that they're taking. So a phase is a step. It's a section of time within the Bible in terms of where this kingdom resides. So the first phase is the Old Testament phase, in which it, meaning the kingdom of heaven to come, is prophesied. It's talked about. It's mentioned. That Christ and His kingdom, the Messiah and His kingdom. It will come. So now there are certain aspects of the coming kingdom that are hidden from the Old Testament. So when Jesus is talking about, especially to the disciples there, about the parables, he says, because it's been given you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. So there's aspects of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus then talks about that isn't necessarily prophesied in the Old Testament. Those are mysteries. Those are things that are kept hidden until Jesus brings it to light. But there are other aspects in the Old Testament that is talked about in terms of the Messiah's kingdom. There is the phase in which it is at hand or present in the person, i.e. Jesus, the person of the king. So, and Jesus, says these things, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is in your heart. These sorts of things, and this is when Jesus is there. He is in present, at the time. So, Jesus was the King of the Jews. He was the coming Messiah. He was the king at the time. But people then rejected him as king. So, it's interesting what Pilate, put up on the accusation above the cross was, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." So the person of the king who was present at the time got rejected, and that leads into phase 3 here, which is the what MacDonald calls the interim phase, which is consisting of those on earth who profess to be his subjects following the king's rejection. That means Jesus' death. But then you have subsequent resurrection and return to heaven. So this is the time following that. Okay, so it's after Christ has left the earth, which is the kingdom as it's operating within what we would call the church age. Okay, so. Then the fourth phase is the manifestation of the kingdom during the 1,000-year reign. You read about that in the book of Revelation. So that would be after the tribulation period of 7 years. Some people think that's going to be really around the corner very soon. But we don't know. We don't know when exactly that's going to come. There's going to be this seven years of bad situation here on the earth, where there's going to be war and rumor of war, and all kinds of problems, pestilence and earthquakes and all kinds of carry on. And then there's going to be this time where Jesus is going to reign on the earth for 1,000 years, and then after that, the devil is allowed out for a short space of time, and he gets kicked into touch, to use a rugby sort of term, and then bound forever in the lake of fire that just burns forever. So that's so the devil then gets ultimately judged, and then there's going to be the last kingdom here, which is the final everlasting kingdom of heaven. Okay, so so there's these five phases that are generally talked about in the Bible, and I think it's important to know these five things because it will then help us to kind of divide things up a bit. Now, chapter 13 of Matthew and the other aspects of the other parables that we're going to be looking at are phase 3. Okay, so this is the interim phase consisting of those on the earth who profess to be his subjects following the king's rejection and return to heaven. So that's us. We are in phase 3. So what we then can learn from these particular parables, I think, is going to be quite interesting. It's going to be quite instructive in terms of our own attitudes, you know, of how we serve the king, how we worship the king, how we treat others that are in the kingdom, both those who profess and those that are there by conversion. So, so we've talked about parable, talked about kingdom of heaven. Next thing we need to do here is just to look briefly then at the list of parables that we're going to be talking about. So what are the parables of the kingdom then? Now, these are, again, the parables that use the phrase or are connected to the phrase, the kingdom of heaven is like. So it's not all the parables that are in the Gospels, because all the parables don't start with this line. So it's focusing on this particular thing. So the first one, even though the parable of the sower, this particular one doesn't use the kingdom of heaven is like it, but however, it is in the this chapter 13 where all the other parables are labeled as such. They use this nomenclature, use this phraseology. The parable of the sower really does set up for ourselves what the members of this kingdom or the people that are in this kingdom are going to look like. So and then it's a major building block because then when you look at the other parables and kind of tie it in with that, you go right. So we're somewhere within this particular range of the four soils that are talked about in that particular parable. Now, some of these parables are mentioned in other Gospels. So, for instance, the parable of the sower that's in Matthew 13, 1-9, is also in Mark 4, 2-20, and Luke 8, 4-15. So it's picked up by the other Gospel writers as a very significant parable. And there is the parable of the wheat and the tares. And this is in Matthew 13, 24-30. Fairly sizable, chunky parable. And the parable of the sower and the parable of the wheat and the tares are the two parables in this chapter that Jesus does explain to the disciples, because the disciples, again, it has been revealed to them by God to ask questions. What does this stuff mean? What is this about? So these two particular parables are explained, and the tools then that Jesus gives in regard to understanding these particular parables then can be applied to one degree or another to the other parables. So now, sometimes you have to be a bit careful because sometimes you can get carried away with some aspects of the parables and end up, spiritualizing absolutely everything that's in there, whereas it might be just more of a general understanding, a general one particular truth that Jesus is attempting to get across. So, but at least we have these two explanations, because I think if we didn't have this, I think we would really be in the dark. I would think there would be an awful lot of disconnect within church as to what these things mean. I mean, we would have denominations basically that are just based on certain kinds of parables, because people then interject all their own wisdom to the things. But at least Jesus gives the explanation, says this is what this means, and then you can't deviate from that because Jesus is saying this is what it is. But the wheat and the tares one is an interesting thing. So for those of you that don't know what a tare is, a tare was a certain kind of plant that resembled wheat when it was growing up, but was poisonous at the end of the day. And you didn't know that it was not wheat until the time of harvest came, because the seeds then, instead of being brown like wheat, the seeds then turned black, and then they were identifiable as tares or weeds. So I think the tares there. I'm just trying to get the oh yeah, it was I think called darnel, something like that. Is what that particular type of plant was called. But anyway, when we get to that, we'll explore that a bit more deeply. And then there's the parable of the mustard seed, which again is another one that's mentioned in all the Gospels, or all the Synoptic Gospels. So it's in Matthew 13, 31 to 32, very short little bit, only 2 verses. Mark 4, 30 to 32. Mark 4 is where a lot of the parables that Jesus teaches in Mark are located. And then there's Luke 13, 18 through 19. So it's a short little thing, but basically it's talking about the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which was one of the smallest seeds in agriculture of the time, and it grew into about a 12 to 14 foot bush or tree. So it started off small, ended up very, very big. But we'll look at what those things mean when we get there. And then there's the parable of the leaven, and that's in 2 of the Gospels, Matthew 13, 33, and Luke 13, 20 to 21. So again, another short parable, can almost be looked at maybe as a proverb, but and this is where Jesus uses so it uses the thing of leaven here, and leaven generally in the Bible was always seen as a sinful thing, but Jesus uses leaven differently here. Now, some commentators sort of hang on to the leaven being sin, and it says in the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. As it says there, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was leaven. And some commentators would actually venture to say that within the kingdom of heaven there's this sin factor that it kind of permeates the entirety of the kingdom, and but Jesus is not looking at it from that angle. He's not looking at the kingdom from that kind of a negative point of view. And so we have to watch sometimes when we're using interpretive tools to handle it correctly, because we can end up going down rabbit trails that are just unhelpful. Then there is the parable of the hidden treasure, which is only 1 verse. These are particular to Matthew. And so, so there's just the one verse there about that. And then there is the parable of the merchant. Now, some of these things, when you look at your study Bibles, the parable of the merchant would be labeled as the parable of the pearl of great price. Now, I would say it's the parable of the merchant, because of the order of words there and the emphasis. And when we get to those particular parables, we'll do hidden treasure and merchant probably together, because they are the two sides of a similar coin. But the interpretation of those particular things, I think, is important. So we'll look at that and learn that. And then the last of the Matthew 13 parables is the parable of the dragnet, and that's the picture of the fishermen that put the net into the sea, and basically they're just gathering whatever they can get their hands on, and then when the thing is brought to shore, they divide up what's good and what's bad. And that is Matthew 13, 47 to 50. So, and all these start with this phrase, the kingdom of heaven is like. So, and this is all within this day and age. This stuff applies to not when the king was amongst us, or in terms of when Jesus was on the earth. It is the time now when Jesus is looking at this particular day and age. Now, there's other parables that don't say the kingdom of heaven is like, that can be rightly looked at as discussions about, how the religious leaders at the time were handling their coming king. So anyway. Then in Matthew 18, which is a parable that we have talked about in studies in days gone by, but we'll go and look at it again, is the unforgiving servant and the king dealing with the accounts of servants, Matthew 18, 21 to 35. And that's where Jesus or Peter was asking, if my brother sins against me, how many times do I forgive him? Up to 7 times. And Jesus says, I don't say you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. So, and then he goes in, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who went to settle accounts with his servants. So, so that is the one that is outside. The first one is outside of the big Matthew 13 bunch. Incidentally, Matthew 13 is the third discourse, the third sort of big sermon, if you want to put it in those terms. In Matthew, there's 5 discourses. There's 5 sort of big sermons. The Sermon on the Mount was the first big one, and then there's the first sort of narrative, or where Jesus is doing things, and then Jesus is talking about things, doing things, talking about things, doing things. So there's a 5 sort of cycles of all that kind of stuff. So right. Next one after that is the parable of the landowner and the workers, and that's in Matthew 20, verses 1 to 16. Instead of sitting here describing it all to you, we'll get there when we get to it. And then we have the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew 22, 2 to 14. And these are interesting ones, because this is starting then to venture toward when Jesus is then going to return. So there's aspects of these kingdom discussions that are actually somewhat time-based, in terms of what's it like in the beginning of this kingdom, in phase 3, what's it like in the middle, and what's it like toward the end of it. And then there's the wise and foolish virgins, the parable about that, and that's tied in with the idea of a wedding feast, and Bobby and I have had some good discussions about these kinds of things. So it's a very, very interesting looking at the how a wedding was conducted in those times of Jesus. You know, because when Jesus was using these kinds of parables, he was talking in terminology that everybody understood. You know, it was agriculture, it was fishing, it was people, you know, laborers working in fields and vineyards, you know, weddings. You know, everybody got this. Everybody understood this. You know, and but so anyway. So okay, and then the last parable here is the parable of the talents, which is in Matthew 25, verse 14 to 30. So those are the 12 parables that we're going to cover in this particular series. And I would say that probably each talk that we'll do will probably end up just covering one particular parable. But as I said, with the hidden treasure and the merchant, because they are related parables, talking about value and the two sides of the same coin, and we'll do those together. So, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so anyway, I'm not going to jump into the parable of the sower because that's for next time.